Hi, I'm John, and you're listening to Paranoid Fantasy, the podcast about bizarre events and the people involved. Usually, we would have Diane here as my co host, the amazing Diane, but she's on vacation right now. So I'm going to try this one solo and see how it goes. But it's a really interesting topic to me. So I think that I can maybe just do a shorter podcast tonight and give you guys an interesting story and something to definitely reflect on. Our story starts actually in Russia. It takes place in October of 1986. I was 4 years old, just to put some perspective there. So that's 32 years, 8 months, and 17 days ago. The setting is Russia, which was the USSR at the time of the incident. We're talking about air travel today. We're talking about a very tragic situation that involves human error or human impulse, and psychology around like flying, and psychology around how pilots work together, and 90 some people trusting one or two people with their lives, which is like everything. Every time I go onto an airplane, I really think about this. That pilot has so much power over what's going to manifest with arriving safely. And this is a very rare story. So of course it's bizarre because it only happens like once in a million times. But again, the story is on October 20th, 1986 in Sverdlovsk, which is now called Yekaterinburg. Sorry for my pronunciation. It was a routine day, but the redundancy of the routine may have contributed to what would become a very strange day. 85 passengers were booked on Aeroflot Flight 6502 departing from Sverdlovsk. For airplane enthusiasts, the serial number was 62327, manufactured on the 28th of June, 1979. The flight included a regular planned stopover at Kuryamak Airport just outside of Samara, Russia. And at the time, Samara, Russia was actually called Kyivshiv. Sorry again for my pronunciation. The flight actually should have lasted about 7.5 hours in duration, including the stopover in what is now Samara. Essentially, the flight was originating from the midwestern part of Russia and heading south to the southwestern part. So it doesn't seem it would have taken so long, but that just shows you, gives you an idea of how vast the country was. It was going to take 7.5 hours. The flight list for Aeroflight 6502 included 85 passengers and a 7-man team, which included pilot Alexander Kliuyev, co-pilot Hennady Zernov, navigating officer Ivan Malkonko, flight engineer Kirev Kamsatov, and 3 flight attendants. This would total 92 souls on board. Now, you might be wondering, am I going to say the names of other crew or passengers of significance, or for example the flight attendants? Don't have that information, and it's really nowhere to be found. That's why, again, we talk about bizarre stories, and this one's very bizarre because the information is really coveted and there's not a lot of details available. So although many reports vary on the number of souls on board, partly due to the withholding of information coming from the USSR or Russia at the time, the top secret report of the chairman of Kubshev Obliskom V.A. Pogodin to the premier of the Soviet Union, Nikolai Roskov, gave slightly different figures. He said that there were 85 passengers and 8 crew members aboard. And that will come into play again when we talk about the contrasting reports of what happened that day. We can imagine passengers were certainly excited about their trip to Grozny. They were headed to Grozny, the capital city of Chechnya in Russia. And that's just, again, it's in the southwestern part of the country. Of course, as flying goes, there may have been some nervous passengers, which is as to be expected. After going through the safety checks, boarding the plane, everything was going as planned. And we'll be right back just to keep going with the story. So we're talking about Aeroflot 6502 that took off on October 20th of 1986. Aeroflot 6502 took off from Sverdlovsk at 14:33 military time, which was actually 2:30 p.m. in Moscow. Just under an hour later, the plane's descent was started at the connecting airport, which is Samara. So again, the plane was heading from Sverdlovsk to Grozky, and it was making a stop in Samara because the flight was, 7.5 hours long. So it was making a planned stop, and actually looking up the same flight today, they actually still make that stop, which I thought was interesting. When coming in for the landing, Captain Alexander Kliuyev, who's the main pilot, he made a bet with the first officer, insisting that he planned to land the Tu-134A aircraft with no visual contact with the ground. So, yeah, you basically heard that right. This pilot, Captain Alexander Kliuyev, who had been flying with the airline for quite some time, suddenly made a decision reportedly, and this is something he admitted to later with his co-pilot, hey, I'm going to go ahead and just try something new today. I'm going to go ahead and fly the plane blind. So he had the co-pilot, the junior to him, close the blinds and basically turn off all of the incoming radios that would have given him any kind of like direction on what the hell are you doing. So Kliuyev ordered the flight engineer to pull the curtains over the cockpit windscreen, boasting that he would have no problem landing the plane using his instruments only. 2 minutes before landing at 3:48 p.m. at an altitude of 1,300 feet. So again, I know somewhat about flying just because I'm an enthusiast from reading books or podcasts or movies and watching like air crash investigation on TV, and just like putting two and two together, they don't allow you to like usually turn your devices on until you reach 30,000 feet. So 30,000 feet is like probably like the average flying zone, I would say. So 1,300 feet is about 1/30th of that, 1/25th of that. So that's pretty low. And that's pretty just crazy. I mean, I don't even know how I'm trying to justify this. It's just like such an, it's just so horrifying to think that somebody would like take a bet on everyone's life to try to do that. And again, it's like a very maybe Russian thing that I am going to land this plane blind or something, but there's really no words. During the landing, alarms were going off, but the pilot ignored them. The air traffic controller suggested the pilot utilize and use an NDB approach, but that was ignored. So you can imagine there's this air traffic controller. He's in the tower. He's looking at what's going on. He's looking at his screen. He's probably got like a visual on the airplane, and he sees maybe something starting to go wrong. There's not a lot of information to work with here, so I'm just hypothesizing. So he's looking out and he's saying something looks funny. They're not responding to the call signals. What is an NDB? That's probably something I should explain. It's a non-directional beacon, which is an instrument inside of the cockpit. It's a low-frequency radio transmitter used as an instrument approach for airports and offshore platforms. So it's basically like it's a radio that's on the tarmac, and it's spinning around and it's sending out a signal to the airplane. And just like sonar works underwater, they can see how far, like is a whale or an object of interest because of the radio waves, how they bounce back. And he's actually suggesting that this pilot used this NDB as a tool to figure out how to to land this plane along with the flight plan that they had. Pilot Kliuyev ignored the alarms and the instructions from the ground control Now the pilots had no visual of the runway whatsoever and refrained from utilizing radio-controlled assistance either. The passengers in the back, I'm sure the crew too, and the, anybody working the flight, they had no knowledge of what was happening within the cockpit, and little did they know that a bet was going on to their demise. So again, this pilot is in the cockpit as if he's playing darts and saying, oh, I could bet you I could hit that mark. Do you want to see? I can prove it. And meanwhile, this isn't like a game of darts. This is an airplane full of 94 souls. When the aircraft was about 215 feet, oh my God, I'm just getting feeling sick a little bit, because I do fly a lot, and this is not a story that's easy to tell, but it's important to tell it. 215 feet above ground, 65 meters, it signaled a ground proximity warning. So again, you see on TV, this alarms beep, 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 beep. You can imagine just like the anxiety in that cockpit with the co-pilot who might not have been in agreement with this plan, and just the chaos, and I'm sure the co-pilot was a junior to Kliuyev, and he's thinking, okay, this is crazy, but this guy, he's like my superior, and he knows what he's doing. Maybe he's just trying to prank me. All right, so pilot Kliuyev further ignored the warning, did not make the suggested go-around. Because at this point, the air traffic controller is like, okay, do not land. You need to go up and circle around and try again. And at that point, he actually could have probably, lifted up, opened up those curtains, and actually landed the plane just like a normal pilot, okay? He ignored that warning, decided to, flip the coin and land this plane. The aircraft touched down at a speed of 150 knots. As expected, all of the landing gear was obliterated upon impact, and the aircraft was then rebounded up in the air after the right wing was ripped off and the left wing was crushed in half. The plane spiraled and came to a halt upside down. So the plane crashed, and pretty much everyone's upside down, hanging from their seatbelts in this airplane. When I was about, I would say 12 or 13 years old, I think I was 12, my brother actually was driving, and we slipped on black ice, and that car actually flipped over, and I remember hanging upside down from the seatbelt, and just it was all in slow motion, like this, because we slipped off of a mountain, and we were going down. Very similar to that opening scene in the movie Misery. We're just sliding down this embankment, and I'm just waiting for us to hit something. And I remember that car just slowly rolling and sliding, and then coming to a stop, and I'm hanging from the seatbelt, and I was just like, ah. I'd like to go ahead and just actually read you the factual report of this flight, because I think it's really interesting. This is actually from the Aviation Safety Network, where they just kind of detail a lot of different flights of significance and flight crashes. And I love this because there's no emotion involved, there's no blame, it just basically tells you exactly what happens. And again, bear with me on my pronunciation. The Tu-134A took off from Sverdlovsk at 14:33 hours Moscow time. The descent was started at 15:31 hours, and the flight crew decided to close the window blinds on the captain's side to carry out a blind landing for training purposes. The aircraft was positioned for an approach to runway 15, and the approach was flown above the glide slope, but within limits. At decision height, the captain decided to continue the approach. Despite the fact that it was not allowed to carry out a blind landing on this flight, the co-pilot or engineer did not intervene. Now that's a really interesting point, because the fact that he closed the blinds is very different than him being blindfolded. And that's kind of where I think there might be some confusion, because lots of pilots actually make blind ground landings, anytime you arrive to a city or an airport at night, or in the rain, or in high fog and low visibility, the pilot's actually flying off of those instruments. So it's not unusual for a pilot to use solely his instruments to land. However, whatever in this case, when the air traffic control, well, first of all, it's just messed up that he even did this, but air traffic control is noticing like something's not right with this landing. You need to use your visuals, or use your what's it called, MDB, or your NDB, yeah. He just refused, and it's almost, I don't even know if it was like a impulsive suicide, or I don't even know, murder-suicide. It was just crazy. But yeah, landing with no visual on the ground, it happens all the time. And it's done successfully. Okay, the aircraft crossed the runway center line at the height of 10 meters, and 1 second before landing, the blinds were opened by the engineer, but this time was too short for the pilot to transition from instrument to visual flight. So that's just like literally 1 second. He opens a thing, that's 1/1000. Boom, and you're already landed and crashing. The aircraft touched down hard, 132 meters past the runway. Threshold at a vertical of speed 5 meters. So I want to say that's a long way. That's like a football field past the runway. This translated to 4.8 G. That's like pretty fast and hard. The left wing collapsed and spilled fuel was ignited. The plane then rolled around the longitudinal axis at a distance of 214 meters from the point of touchdown. The main part of the aircraft came to a stop 70 meters to the left of the runway axis and caught fire. So this plane was like totally off of the runway and did not have any chance of surviving this impact because, again, this pilot was out of his mind, and beyond that, he was unqualified to be flying, it seems like. We'll go ahead and take a break. Okay, so we're actually talking about this aircraft in Russia. I mean, it is one of the most bizarre stories that this pilot had actually taken all of these people's lives, and the reputation of this airline and the whole reputation of flying in general at still sort of an early age of flying. I mean, this was 30 years ago, which was like, flying was around since like the 20s, but still it wasn't like we are today where we have millions of flights and a lot of people are trusting flying. Like, this was at a sensitive time, and it was in the USSR, and since then there have been like actual many cases of pilots that supposedly have either sabotaged the flight or done like suicide murders, or ditch the plane, etc. So, this is unique in the way that there's not a lot of information available, but it does happen. When the plane erupted into flames, 63 people instantly died, which consisted of 4 crew members. 7 more died later in the hospital. A top secret report, again, of this chairman from the premier of the Soviet Union, Nikolai Ryzhkov, gave slightly different figures. He said that 53 passengers and 5 crew members died in the crash, and 11 more in the hospital later. It is unknown what leads to this difference in the report, but the numbers are still pretty close, so it doesn't feel like a big conspiracy. I think it's just like one person off. Among the passengers were 14 children, all of whom survived the accident. That's pretty interesting and amazing because, I don't know, that makes me think that people are really concerned about getting those children, those babies out, But it also impresses me that the seat belts, like that they were actually secured in their seats when this happened. But we also know that like kids and young people sometimes are more resilient in times of like trauma and sickness. So that's really, really cool. Ironically, both pilots originally survived this crash. Reportedly, co-pilot Zernov immediately started helping others and evacuating as many passengers as he could. It was said that he stuck his head out of the plane just to catch a breath after this crash landing, but immediately jumped back to help with the rescue. He later died from a cardiac arrest and an ambulance en route to the hospital caused by large amounts of smoke that he inhaled. Now, what happened to our chief pilot? Chief pilot Kliuyev miraculously survived, and there's no report of what his actions were upon the landing. Pilot Kliuyev later claimed that he was testing his abilities. So we're talking about when he actually was tried and went to court. He claimed he was testing his abilities, but was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was released after 6 years. Soviet officials discovered at the trial that Kliuyev tried to make the blind landing to test his ability as a pilot and win a bet. He appeared cool and composed during the trial, even though the Soviet media blamed the tragic crash on his overblown sense of self-assurance. A report issued at the time found that Kliuyev broke every rule on his blind landing. The chain of events that led to the crash could have been broken, but no one spoke up, leading to the tragic deaths of so many innocent lives. Now, this is the report that's coming from that trial. When I really start to I was like, okay, Chuck, let's break this apart. Who's telling this information? Where is it coming from? It's all coming from one person. I think it's really interesting, and I wish Diane were here to discuss this with me, because I think it's interesting, that he admitted to doing this, because it seems he wouldn't have had to do that other than the reports coming from the air traffic controller. Like, he could have probably made up a story because there was no one to really refute his story, that he could have blamed it on something mechanical, or God knows what he could have blamed it on. But I think either they had a really good prosecutor, or he was just ready to come clean, or maybe he was like a sociopath. But he admitted to the whole thing. However, because he admitted to it, I think it's interesting that people sort of just buy from all the accounts that I read. They just kind of buy the fact that this was a bet. And unless there's more information that I'm not familiar with, what's not to say that this isn't something that he actually just did on his own recognizance? Because there was a similar situation in Japan where there was a senior captain who actually made a decision to follow this instrument that the younger junior co-pilot knew was actually faulty, and he was trying to weigh in and originally say you're flying at the wrong level, and we're actually heading towards the ground in a dive. But culturally in Japan at the time, that junior pilot was too afraid to speak up, because culturally it's so indoctrinated into etiquette that you don't question a senior captain. And since then, there's actually been a lot of the procedures changed. Many procedures have changed, and they're always changing in the FAA, Federal Aviation, and the flight laws about how captains work together. So I don't think this would necessarily have happened today, because there's a lot of redundancy, and the captains actually have sort of, I think, more of a system of working together. But I just think it's interesting that this pilot, Captain Kliuyev, he took responsibility for it, but he also said, oh yeah, it's a dare, which is sort of like, when kids say, oh, it's peer pressure, that's why, I smoked a cigarette or something. So we don't really know if this was a dare or not, or a bet. And what kind of bet is that anyway? Because, if you win, you landed the plane. If you lose, again, you're taking everyone's, it's not even worth talking about in that way. There was not a lot of, there's no survivor's account, like at least online, the library, there's nothing. This was this was surprising at the time. Not many people actually knew about this crash. Actually, it was several years. The KGB had strict control over the media at the time. They were able to keep the images out of the public completely. If it weren't for Fire Department Chief Colonel A.K. Karpov, who actually decided to quickly take some pictures when he went in to investigate the scene of the crash, like right after it happened. He actually did take some pictures, which are available online, and they're pretty graphic. And his account's pretty graphic. I don't really want to go into it. I don't think it serves the story anymore from our angle. But he did take some pictures. He smuggled them out before anyone could take them. Otherwise, we may not even have ever known about this crash. And actually, his photos turned up in the public realm many years later, and that's what has made this story public knowledge. So, I mean, that's just amazing to me that, like, especially in today's time, if you had anything happen, I mean, it's like if someone's coffee spills on them at a McDonald's, like on Twitter, everyone knows. Or if somebody's like, you know, on an Aeroflot, like missing their flight, or like, for example, they get harassed on a flight. It's like they tweet it, and then everyone knows, and they're tagging like the airline. And people that have actually been in a plane crash, they're tweeting, live tweeting, Instagramming, Facebooking, like running from the plane. So everything is everywhere now. So it's like, it's even so shocking now that, you know, this was 1986. It's a long time ago, but not that long ago. But having all of these people, like 53 people, it sounds like, actually survived, and their stories haven't made it out into the media. Not even by their children or their grandchildren. And so that, it makes it seem like there's like a pretty intense cover-up, or maybe they were threatened afterwards. Who knows? But I've been close to Russia. I've never been to Russia. I've actually been to Poland, and that's a country of people that are very tight-lipped. They're not like, when you speak to them, ask them about their history, most of them are not just like willing to go forth and tell you the things that they've been through. That was my experience. So I can imagine also having friends from Russia, Slovakia, and places in that region. I don't have experience with those types of people just like freely telling me their stories. So there must be something about their integrity, or just their cultural traditions, that they're not like, they're not like Americans who are just like blah 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 blah. This is what happened. I just wanted to, I don't know, end this on, like, I always try to end these stories, like, try to find the silver lining. I don't know much that can be said for this story, except for, it's just really sad for those people that lost their lives, and it's sad also for, I want to just go back really quickly and say, like, what are the reasons that people think that this story didn't get covered at the time? Because, I mean, news media was still alive and well, even though there was not Instagram or Twitter. Like, news media, things were being covered. Aeroflot, the airline, actually was one of the highest rated airlines in the world. And so they had almost like a perfect safety record. I don't think they even had a crash. And that's a Russian airline. So you've got Russia right now. There's really in this like conflict with the United States of America, this power thing, this power struggle. And so it makes sense that the government would not want to expose this truth about such a horrible accident, especially the negligence of a human being playing games. And so that would have very much damaged the airline, the country, been a very embarrassing. And so, yeah, it makes sense. Who knows? Again, what we talk about here is just based on my research, my opinions, but I'm sure there's more to the story. I just want to definitely thank and credit the reports that I received from Wikipedia, WTFX, the LA Times, Knowledge Nuts, Blitzlift, and the Aviation Safety Network. This is primarily where I did my research, and thank you so much for listening to Paranoid Fantasy, and I can't wait to be back with you for the next episode where Diane will join us again. Have a great one.